The Dark Story of the President, shot at Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln, 1865. The gas lamps were already lit when the carriage arrived on 10th Street. It was Good Friday, April 14th, 1865. Washington was still wet from afternoon rain. The war had been over for 5 days, though the city didn't yet feel peaceful. It felt suspended, tired, waiting for something it couldn't name. Abraham Lincoln stepped down from the carriage and looked up at the theater. Ford's Theater, a place he'd been before. Not grand by European standards, but respectable, brick facade. 3 stories, large enough to matter in a city that was still learning how to be a capital. He was late. The play had already started. His wife Mary was with him. So were their guests, a young couple. Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. They were filling in. The original guests had declined. Inside, the theater was warm, crowded. Over 1,000 people packed into narrow rows of seats. The air smelled of oil lamps, wool coats, sweat, and perfume. On stage, the actors were performing Our American Cousin, a comedy, light material, something to laugh at after 4 years of slaughter. When Lincoln entered his box, the orchestra stopped. The actors froze. The audience rose. Applause filled the room like a wave. Lincoln nodded, smiled briefly, and sat down. The play resumed. But in the shadows behind him, a man was already inside the theater. He had been there for hours, moving through hallways, checking doors, rehearsing. His name was John Wilkes Booth. He was 26 years old, handsome, famous, one of the most celebrated actors in America. And he was about to commit the most public murder in the nation's history. This is not a story about a lone gunman. It is a story about what happens when a country tears itself apart and then tries to stitch itself back together before the wound has even stopped bleeding. It is about a man who believed he was saving his country by killing its leader, and it is about the 15 hours that followed the gunshot, the chaos, the dying, the manhunt, and the question no one wanted to answer: what happens to a fractured nation when the one man holding it together is suddenly gone? Abraham Lincoln had not wanted to go to the theater that night. He was exhausted. The war had aged him in ways that photographs could barely capture. He was 56, but looked 70. His face was gaunt. His eyes were sunken. He had trouble sleeping. Nightmares came often. In one, he had dreamed of walking through the White House and finding a body lying in state. When he asked who had died, a soldier told him, "The president, killed by an assassin." He had told that dream to his wife, to his friends, to members of his cabinet. Some of them dismissed it as stress, the mind playing tricks after years of unimaginable pressure. But Lincoln seemed haunted by it. He mentioned it more than once in his final days, as if he knew something was coming, as if he could feel the shadow moving closer. Mary had insisted they go. She thought it would be good for him, good for the public to see him, good for morale. The city needed to see that the president was still there, still standing, still human. Lincoln had agreed, reluctantly. He had even invited Ulysses Grant, the general who had won the war. Grant declined. His wife didn't like Mary Lincoln. The two women had clashed before. Social politics, petty grievances, the kind of friction that exists even in the aftermath of war. So the Lincolns brought Major Rathbone and Clara Harris instead, young, eager, loyal, people who would be honored by the invitation. The box they sat in was decorated for the occasion. Flags draped the balcony, red, white, and blue bunting. A portrait of George Washington hung on the wall. The box was elevated, positioned stage left, about 12 feet above the main floor. It gave a clear view of the stage and the audience below, but it also made Lincoln visible, exposed, a target. The presidential box at Ford's Theater was not designed for security. It was designed for spectacle, for being seen. In 1865, the idea that a president needed constant protection was not yet fully formed. There had been threats before, angry letters, rumors of plots, but nothing had materialized. Lincoln himself was fatalistic about it. He once said that if someone wanted to kill him badly enough, they would find a way. No amount of guards could prevent it. John Wilkes Booth knew the layout of Ford's Theater better than almost anyone. He had performed there many times. He knew which doors were locked, which hallways were empty, which stagehands could be bribed or distracted. He knew that the box where Lincoln sat had a small hallway leading to it, and he knew that the door to that hallway had a broken lock. Booth had not always been a murderer. He had been raised in Maryland, the son of a famous British actor. The Booth family was theatrical royalty. John's father, Junius Brutus Booth, had been one of the greatest actors of his generation. Brilliant on stage, unstable off it. He drank, he raged, he disappeared for days. He once tried to kill a theater manager. The Booth children grew up in a household that was equal parts genius and madness. John's older brother, Edwin, was considered the greatest Shakespearean actor of his generation. Controlled, refined, a master of his craft. John was talented too, but volatile, passionate. He lacked Edwin's discipline. He was more physical, more emotional. He played to the crowd, and the crowd loved him. Women threw flowers at his feet. Men bought him drinks. He was a star. But John Booth was also a Southerner. He loved the South. He loved slavery. He saw the Confederacy not as a rebellion, but as a noble cause, a fight for sovereignty, for tradition, for a way of life. He believed that the South was defending the principles of the Founding Fathers, that the North was the aggressor, that Lincoln was a tyrant who had trampled the Constitution. When the war began, Booth did not enlist. He stayed in the North, performing, making money, but he seethed. He watched as Union armies marched deeper into Virginia, as Southern cities burned. As Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, to Booth, this was the final betrayal. The war was no longer about preserving the Union. It was about destroying the Southern way of life, about freeing slaves who, in Booth's view, were not capable of freedom. Booth's racism was not unusual for his time. Even many Northerners believed in the inferiority of black people. But Booth's beliefs were more extreme, more rigid. He saw slavery as a divine institution. He believed that black people were naturally subservient, that freeing them would lead to chaos, to race war, to the destruction of civilization. As the war dragged on, Booth became convinced that killing Lincoln would be a service to his country, an act of patriotism. He compared himself to Brutus, who killed Caesar to save the Roman Republic. He saw Lincoln as a dictator, a man who had suspended habeas corpus, who had jailed newspaper editors, who had prosecuted the war with a ruthlessness that Booth found unforgivable. He was not alone. Booth had co-conspirators. They were a ragged group, small-time criminals, Confederate sympathizers, drifters. None of them were particularly competent, but they were willing. The original plan had been to kidnap Lincoln, to smuggle him south and ransom him for Confederate prisoners, but the war ended before they could act. Lee surrendered on April 9th. The Confederacy collapsed. Booth's kidnapping plot became irrelevant, so he changed the plan. If he couldn't save the Confederacy, he would avenge it. He would kill Lincoln, and he would kill the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State, William Seward. He would decapitate the Union government in one night, throw the country into chaos, give the South a chance to rise again. It was a fantasy, a delusion born of desperation and rage. But Booth believed it. He believed that without Lincoln, the Union would fall apart, that the Southern states would reassert their independence, that history would vindicate him. On the morning of April 14th, Booth learned that Lincoln would be attending Ford's Theater that night. He gathered his conspirators. He assigned roles. George Atzerodt would kill Vice President Johnson at his hotel. Lewis Powell would kill Secretary Seward at his home. Booth would kill Lincoln at the theater. They would strike simultaneously at 10:15 p.m. Then they would flee south into Confederate territory and be hailed as heroes. Booth spent the day preparing. He went to the theater and carved a peephole in the door to Lincoln's box. He placed a wooden bar nearby so he could wedge the door shut after entering. He checked his weapons. A single-shot Derringer pistol, a large hunting knife. He visited a tavern and drank, not enough to dull his senses, but enough to steady his nerves. He wrote a letter to a newspaper, explaining his actions. He wanted the world to know why he had done it. In the letter, Booth portrayed himself as a hero, a patriot, a man forced to act because no one else would. He wrote that he loved the Union, but that Lincoln had destroyed it, that the South had been wronged, that someone had to strike a blow for justice. The letter was never published. After the assassination, it was deemed too inflammatory, too dangerous. It was locked away in government archives. By evening, Booth was ready. He arrived at Ford's Theater around 9:30 p.m. He moved through the building with ease. No one stopped him. He was famous, familiar, welcome. Theater staff greeted him by name. He went to the basement and had a drink. He waited. At 10 p.m., he climbed the stairs to the dress circle. He walked along the back of the theater, past the audience, toward the door that led to Lincoln's box. A man was supposed to be guarding that door. John Parker, a Metropolitan Police officer assigned to protect the president. But Parker was not there. He had left his post. Some say he went to watch the play. Others say he went to a nearby tavern. Either way, the door was unguarded. Booth opened it without resistance. John Parker's absence is one of the great mysteries of the assassination. He was a poor choice for the job. His record as a police officer was terrible. He had been charged with drunkenness, with sleeping on duty, with visiting prostitutes while in uniform. He was known to be unreliable. Yet he was assigned to protect the president. After the assassination, Parker was not punished. He was not fired. He simply disappeared from the historical record. No one knows what happened to him. Booth stepped into the narrow hallway. He could hear laughter from the stage. The play was nearing the end of the second act. He moved quietly. He wedged the wooden bar against the door behind him, sealing it shut. Then he approached the door to the box itself. He looked through the peephole he had carved earlier. He could see Lincoln, sitting in a rocking chair, relaxed, leaning forward slightly, watching the play. Mary Lincoln was beside him. She was holding his hand. It was a rare moment of intimacy. The Lincolns' marriage had been difficult. Mary was unstable, prone to mood swings. She spent money recklessly. She was jealous, paranoid. She had alienated much of Washington society. But Lincoln loved her. He endured her outbursts. He forgave her excesses. He held her hand. Major Rathbone and Clara Harris sat to the left. They were young, in love, excited to be in the presence of the president. They had no idea what was about to happen. Booth opened the door. He stepped inside. The box was small, dark. Lincoln was less than 5 feet away. Booth raised the Derringer. He pointed it at the back of Lincoln's head, and he fired. The gunshot was small, a sharp crack, muffled by laughter. The audience didn't notice at first. On stage, an actor named Harry Hawk was delivering a line that always got a big laugh. "Something about knowing enough to turn you inside out," the audience roared. In that moment of noise, Booth pulled the trigger. The bullet was small, a lead ball, .44 caliber. It entered Lincoln's skull, just behind his left ear. It tore through his brain, crossing from the left side to the right. It destroyed the motor cortex, the speech center, the parts of the brain that control consciousness. It lodged behind his right eye socket. Lincoln's head dropped forward. His body went limp. He never spoke again. He never opened his eyes. Mary screamed. She turned and saw Booth standing there, smoke rising from the pistol. Rathbone lunged at him. Booth dropped the pistol and pulled out his knife. He slashed Rathbone across the arm, cutting deep into the muscle. The blade severed an artery. Blood sprayed across the box, across the flags, across Mary's dress. Rathbone tried to grab Booth again, but the blood made his hands slippery. Booth pushed him away and jumped onto the railing of the box. He intended to leap to the stage below, land gracefully, and shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the state motto of Virginia. A statement of defiance. It was theatrical, dramatic, exactly the kind of moment Booth had imagined. But his spur caught on, a flag draped over the balcony. He fell awkwardly. He landed hard on the stage, breaking his left fibula. Pain shot up his leg, but he forced himself to stand. He turned to the audience, many of whom still didn't understand what had happened. He shouted the Latin phrase. Then he limped off stage and out the back door. Behind him, chaos erupted. Mary Lincoln was screaming. Rathbone was bleeding. People in the audience were shouting. Some thought it was part of the play. Others thought it was an accident. A few understood immediately that something terrible had happened. A young army surgeon named Charles Leal was sitting in the dress circle. He heard Mary scream. He saw Rathbone covered in blood. He rushed to the box. He climbed over seats and forced open the barricaded door. He found Lincoln slumped in his chair, unconscious, not breathing. Leal tilted Lincoln's head back and cleared his airway. He performed artificial respiration, mouth to mouth, trying to get air into Lincoln's lungs. Lincoln gasped. His heart was still beating. But Leal knew immediately that the wound was fatal. He had seen enough battlefield injuries to recognize when a man was beyond saving. Other doctors arrived. They examined the wound. They probed it with their fingers, trying to locate the bullet. This was standard medical practice at the time, but it only made things worse. It introduced bacteria. It caused more damage. Not that it mattered. Lincoln was already dying. They couldn't leave Lincoln in the theater. The crowd was too loud, too panicked. Leal and several others carried Lincoln out of the box, down the stairs, and into the street. Rain was falling again. They looked for a carriage, but there were too many people. Someone suggested a boarding house across the street, the Peterson House. They carried Lincoln inside. The Peterson House was owned by a German tailor named William Peterson. It was a narrow 3-story building, plain, modest, the kind of place where government clerks rented rooms. Peterson himself was not home. A boarder let them in. The room they placed Lincoln in was small, a back bedroom on the first floor. The bed was too short for Lincoln's 6'4" frame. They laid him diagonally across it. Leal removed Lincoln's coat and shirt. He examined the wound again. There was nothing he could do. The bullet had destroyed too much of the brain. Lincoln would not recover. He would not wake. He was dying. The only question was how long it would take. Word spread quickly. Cabinet members arrived. Generals, senators. Robert Lincoln, the president's oldest son, rushed to the boarding house. He found his father unconscious, breathing irregularly, blood seeping from the wound. He stood in the corner of the room, crying. Mary Lincoln came and went, unable to bear the sight of her husband dying. She would rush into the room, sob over his body, then be led away by friends. At one point she cried out, "Why didn't they kill me instead?" No one had an answer. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, took control. He set up a command post in the front parlor. He began issuing orders. Lock down the city. Close the bridges. Search every building. Find Booth. Stanton was a hard man, efficient, ruthless. He had clashed with Lincoln many times, but he respected him, and now he would make sure that Lincoln's killer was caught. Outside, Washington descended into chaos. Mobs formed in the streets. Rumors spread. Some said the entire cabinet had been killed. Others said the Confederacy had launched a new offensive. Soldiers flooded the city. Checkpoints went up. Anyone trying to leave was stopped and searched. But Booth was already gone. He had escaped through the back of the theater, mounted a horse he had left waiting in the alley, and ridden out of the city. His leg was broken, but adrenaline kept him moving. He met up with David Harold, one of his co-conspirators. Together, they rode south into Maryland. Booth was in agony. Every movement sent pain shooting through his leg, but he kept going. He believed he had done something glorious, something that would change history. He expected to be hailed as a hero. He imagined crowds cheering his name, statues erected in his honor. He had no idea that he had just made himself the most hated man in America. The other parts of Booth's plan had failed. George Atzerodt had been assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but when the moment came, Atzerodt lost his nerve. He got drunk instead and wandered the streets. Johnson was never in danger. Atzerodt would be arrested within days. He would be hanged for conspiracy, even though he never attempted the murder. Lewis Powell had more success. He went to the home of Secretary of State William Seward, who was bedridden after a carriage accident. Powell forced his way inside, claiming to have medicine from Seward's doctor. When Seward's son refused to let him in, Powell attacked him with a pistol, fracturing his skull. Powell then rushed upstairs to Seward's bedroom. He attacked Seward with a knife, slashing his face and neck. Seward's other son and a male nurse tried to stop him. Powell stabbed them too. Blood covered the walls, the floor, the bed. Powell was like a demon, unstoppable, but Seward survived. His neck brace, worn because of the carriage accident, had protected his throat from the deepest cuts. The metal frame deflected the blade. Powell fled into the night, covered in blood, lost and confused. He wandered the streets of Washington for 3 days. He had no plan, no place to go. He eventually returned to the boarding house where the conspirators had met, hoping to find help. Instead, he found soldiers. He was arrested without a fight. Back at the Peterson house, Lincoln's breathing grew shallower. His pulse weakened. Doctors applied mustard plasters to his chest, trying to stimulate his heart. It didn't work. His extremities grew cold. His face turned ashen. The wound continued to bleed, slowly, steadily, draining the life from him. Throughout the night, people came and went. Some stood in silence, others prayed. Stanton worked in the front room, interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence, issuing orders. He was building a case. Even before Lincoln was dead, Stanton was planning the prosecution. At 7:22 a.m., on April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's heart stopped. Charles Lyell placed his hand over Lincoln's chest and felt nothing. He looked at the other doctors. They nodded. Stanton stood. He looked at the body of the president, and he said, quietly, "Now he belongs to the ages." Some accounts say, he said, "Now he belongs to the angels." The words were similar, spoken softly, heard differently by different people, but the meaning was the same. Lincoln was gone. He was no longer a man. He was a symbol, a martyr, an idea. The room fell silent. Outside, the rain had stopped. Morning light filtered through the windows. The man who had led the country through its darkest war was dead, killed in a moment of celebration, killed by one of its own. The news spread across the country like wildfire. Telegraph wires carried the message to every city, every town, every village. Abraham Lincoln was dead, assassinated, murdered. The nation went into shock. In New York, crowds gathered in the streets. Some wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence. In Chicago, businesses closed. Flags were lowered to half-staff. In Boston, church bells tolled for hours. Even in the South, in cities that had celebrated Confederate victories, there was a strange quiet, a sense that something terrible had happened, something that would change everything. The hunt for Booth became the largest manhunt in American history up to that point. Thousands of soldiers fanned out across Maryland and Virginia. Roadblocks were set up, farms were searched, rewards were offered. $25,000 for Booth, dead or alive. $50,000 for anyone who helped him escape. Booth and Harold moved slowly. Booth's leg was badly broken. Every step was agony. They stopped at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a Maryland physician with Southern sympathies. Mudd set Booth's leg and gave him crutches. Later, Mudd would claim he didn't recognize Booth, that he was simply helping an injured man. Few believed him. He was arrested and eventually sentenced to life in prison. Booth and Harold continued south. They hid in swamps. They slept in barns. They avoided roads. They relied on Confederate sympathizers to feed them, to hide them. But the network of Southern supporters was collapsing. People were afraid. The war was over. Helping Booth meant risking execution. Booth kept a diary. In it, he wrote that he had struck a blow for freedom, that history would remember him as a hero, that he had done what had to be done. He wrote that he was hunted like a dog, that his name was being cursed across the country. He seemed genuinely confused. He had expected glory. Instead, he was a fugitive, broken, desperate, alone. On April 26th, 12 days after the assassination, Union soldiers found Booth and Harold hiding in a tobacco barn on a farm in Virginia. They surrounded the barn and demanded surrender. Harold gave up immediately. Booth refused. The soldiers set the barn on fire, hoping to force him out. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, a sergeant named Boston Corbett saw Booth moving inside. Corbett was a strange man. Religious, fanatical. He had castrated himself years earlier to avoid temptation. He claimed to hear the voice of God. When he saw Booth through the flames, he raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spine. Soldiers dragged Booth out of the burning barn. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He could barely speak. He asked someone to lift his hands so he could see them. They did. He looked at his hands and whispered, "Useless, useless." He died a few hours later. His body was brought back to Washington and identified. Then it was buried in secret in an unmarked grave at a federal arsenal to prevent it from becoming a shrine. Years later, his family was allowed to claim the body. It was reburied in an unmarked plot in a Baltimore cemetery. Even in death, Booth was denied the recognition he craved. Booth's co-conspirators were arrested, 4 of them, including Mary Surratt, in whose boarding house the conspirators had met, were hanged. Mary Surratt's execution was controversial. She claimed she knew nothing of the plot, that her boarding house was simply a place where Booth and the others met. But the government wanted blood. It wanted justice. Mary Surratt became the first woman executed by the federal government. Others were imprisoned. Dr. Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Arnold, Edmund Spangler. They were sent to Fort Jefferson, a remote military prison in the dry Tortugas. The conditions were brutal. O'Laughlin died of yellow fever. The others were eventually pardoned. The trial was swift and harsh. The country wanted closure. It wanted to believe that the conspiracy had been crushed, that the guilty had been punished, that justice had been served. But the trial raised more questions than it answered. How deep did the conspiracy go? Were Confederate leaders involved? Was it a small group of fanatics, or something larger? The government investigated. It found no evidence of a larger conspiracy, no connection to Jefferson Davis or other Confederate leaders, just a small group of desperate men, deluded, angry, willing to kill for a cause that was already dead. But closure did not come easily. Lincoln's assassination did not reunify the country. It deepened the divide. The South, already defeated, was now subject to even harsher Reconstruction policies. Andrew Johnson, who became president, was a Southern Democrat with little interest in protecting the rights of freed slaves. He clashed with Congress. He was impeached, though not removed from office. The hopes that Lincoln had represented, a just and merciful peace, died with him. The question that haunted the nation was not just who killed Lincoln, but what his death meant. Booth believed he was avenging the South, but he did not save it. He made its suffering worse. He turned Lincoln into a symbol, a martyr, a saint, and he ensured that the memory of the Confederacy would be forever tainted by his act. Lincoln had been a complicated man. He was not the perfect saint that later generations made him out to be. He had been pragmatic, sometimes cold. He had suspended habeas corpus. He had censored newspapers. He had prosecuted the war with a ruthlessness that shocked even his allies. But he had also been deeply moral. He had believed in the Union, in equality, in the possibility of redemption. He had grown up poor, born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky. His mother died when he was 9. He had little formal education. He taught himself to read. He worked as a rail splitter, a store clerk, a surveyor. He became a lawyer through sheer determination. He entered politics as a Whig, then as a Republican. He believed in progress, in industry, in the idea that America could be better. His presidency was defined by war. From the moment he took office, the country was tearing itself apart. 7 states had already seceded. 4 more would follow. Lincoln's first act as president was to decide whether to resupply Fort Sumter, a federal fort in South Carolina. He chose to resupply it. The Confederates fired on the fort. The war began. For 4 years, Lincoln waged a war that killed more Americans than any other conflict in history. 620,000 dead, millions wounded, entire cities destroyed, families torn apart. The cost was unimaginable, and Lincoln bore it all. Every casualty report, every letter to a grieving widow, every decision to send more men into battle. He evolved during the war. At the beginning, he said the war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. But by 1863, he had changed his mind. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in Confederate states. It was a military strategy, a moral statement, a redefinition of the war. It turned the conflict into a struggle for human freedom. Not everyone supported him. Even in the North, there was opposition. Copperheads, they were called. Northern Democrats who wanted peace, who believed the war was a mistake, who called Lincoln a tyrant. There were draft riots, protests, calls for his removal. Lincoln endured it all. And he had been tired, so tired. Those who knew him in his final days said he seemed relieved that the war was over. He spoke of going to California, of traveling, of rest. He had carried the weight of 600,000 deaths. He had signed letters to widows. He had walked through hospitals filled with dying boys. He had heard the screams of amputees. He had done what he believed was necessary, and it had broken something inside him. On the night he died, he had been laughing. watching a comedy, holding his wife's hand. For a few hours, he had been able to forget, to be something other than a president, to be a man. And then a bullet ended it. Ford's Theater closed after the assassination. The government seized the building. For years, it was used as a warehouse, then as an office building. In 1893, part of the building collapsed, killing 22 clerks. It seemed cursed, haunted. People said they could hear footsteps in the empty hallways, whispers, the echo of a gunshot. Eventually, the building was restored and turned into a museum. Today, people visit the box where Lincoln sat. They look at the rocking chair, the flags, the portrait of Washington. They stand where Booth stood, and they ask the same question people have been asking for over 150 years. Could it have been prevented? The answer is yes, easily. If John Parker, the guard, had stayed at his post, Booth would never have gotten close. If the door had been locked properly, Booth would have been stopped. If Lincoln had chosen a different theater, a different night, a different play, if any one of a dozen small decisions had been different, Lincoln would have lived. But those decisions were not different, and Lincoln died, and the country that emerged from his death was not the one he had hoped for. Reconstruction failed. The South rebuilt itself on the backs of sharecroppers and Jim Crow laws. The promise of equality was deferred for another century. The war had ended slavery, but it had not ended racism. It had not ended hatred. It had not healed the wounds. The years after Lincoln's death were hard. Andrew Johnson fought with Congress. The radical Republicans wanted to punish the South, to ensure that freed slaves had rights. Johnson resisted. He vetoed bills. He pardoned former Confederates. He was impeached by the House of Representatives. He survived the Senate trial by 1 vote. Eventually, Reconstruction ended. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and the South reimposed white supremacy through violence, through terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan rose. Black people were lynched. Their right to vote was stripped away through poll taxes and literacy tests. The promise of the 14th and 15th Amendments was betrayed. It would take another century before the civil rights movement would force the country to confront its failure, before the promises of Reconstruction would be partially fulfilled, before Black Americans would gain the rights they should have been granted in 1865. Lincoln did not live to see any of this. He did not see Reconstruction fail. He did not see the rise of Jim Crow. He did not see the betrayal of the cause he had fought for. He died believing that the war had achieved something, that slavery was ended, that the Union was preserved, that the country could heal. Booth thought he was making history. He thought his name would be remembered alongside Brutus, that he would be celebrated as a defender of liberty. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a warning, a symbol of what happens when ideology hardens into fanaticism, when love of a cause becomes indistinguishable from hatred of its enemies. Lincoln, by contrast, became mythologized, elevated, turned into something more than human. Schools were named after him, monuments built, his face carved into mountains. He became the martyred president, the savior of the Union, the great emancipator. But in that transformation, something was lost. The man himself, the melancholy, the doubt, the exhaustion, the complexity. People who knew Lincoln said he was funny, that he told jokes, that he loved to laugh, that he could be crude, that he struggled with depression, that he was awkward in social situations, that he was deeply kind, that he forgave easily, that he held grudges, that he was human. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington portrays him as a god, seated, larger than life, marble, perfect. But the real Lincoln was not marble. He was flesh. He was tired. He was scarred. He was doing his best, in impossible circumstances. The truth is that Lincoln was not killed because he was a tyrant. He was killed because he had won, because the South had lost, because a young actor could not accept that the world he loved was dying. Booth killed Lincoln not to save the Confederacy, but to deny its defeat. To strike one last blow, to matter, and he did matter, but not in the way he intended. He did not change history, he only confirmed it. The Confederacy was dead, slavery was over, the Union had survived. Booth's bullet could not undo any of that. It only ensured that the peace would be harder, the reconciliation slower, the cost higher. In the end, the story of Lincoln's assassination is not about inevitability. It is about choices, small choices, a guard who left his post, a door that wasn't locked, a man who chose hatred over acceptance, a president who chose to go to a play when he could have stayed home. And it is about what comes after, the long, hard work of healing, of rebuilding, of trying to make sense of violence, of asking whether the cost was worth it, whether the sacrifice meant anything, whether the dead are honored by what the living do next. Lincoln believed in the possibility of a better country. He believed that the war, terrible as it was, could lead to something greater, a nation where all men were truly equal, where the sins of the past could be redeemed. He did not live to see whether that belief was justified. He died hoping. His second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his death, is considered one of the greatest speeches in American history. In it, he spoke of malice toward none, of charity for all, of binding up the nation's wounds, of doing all which may achieve a just and lasting peace. It was a vision of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of moving forward together. But reconciliation requires both sides to participate. And the South was not ready to forgive. It was not ready to accept defeat. It was not ready to grant equality to freed slaves. And so the wounds did not heal. They festered, they became infected, and they poisoned the country for generations. Booth believed in a fantasy, in a world that could not be saved, in the righteousness of his anger. He died broken and paralyzed, whispering that his hands were useless. In his final moments, he realized that he had accomplished nothing, that his grand gesture had been for nothing, that history would not remember him as a hero. One man is remembered as a hero, the other as a villain, but both of them were human. Both of them made choices, and both of them, in their own way, shaped the country that came after. Ford's Theater still stands. The box where Lincoln sat is preserved exactly as it was. The rocking chair is gone, moved to a museum, but the space remains. Visitors stand in it and try to imagine what it felt like. The laughter, the gunshot, the chaos. They look down at the stage and wonder what Booth was thinking, whether he hesitated, whether he felt anything other than certainty. There are no answers in that room, only questions, only the weight of history, only the knowledge that in that small space, on that spring night, everything changed. The Peterson House is also preserved. The room where Lincoln died is kept as it was. The bed is too short. The walls are plain. It is a small room, an ordinary room, the kind of room where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. But on that night, it became the place where a president died, where a nation lost its leader, where history turned, and maybe that is the point. Not to find easy answers, not to simplify, not to turn the story into a moral lesson, but to sit with the complexity, to understand that history is not made by heroes and villains alone, but by ordinary people making choices in impossible circumstances, by guards who abandon their posts, by actors who believe they are patriots, by presidents who just wanted to laugh for a few hours. Lincoln's last words, according to some accounts, were spoken to Mary. She had asked him what a woman sitting near them might think of her holding his hand so publicly. Lincoln smiled and said, "She won't think anything about it." Those were not the words of a man expecting to die. They were the words of a man who, for just a moment, felt safe, who believed the worst was over, who thought he might finally rest. He was wrong. But maybe that's the most human thing of all. To hope, to believe, even for a moment, that the storm has passed, that the night will be peaceful, that tomorrow will come. Lincoln did not get his tomorrow. The bullet saw to that, but the country did. It stumbled forward. It failed in many ways. It betrayed many of the ideals Lincoln died for, but it survived. It endured. And in that endurance, there is something worth remembering. The funeral train that carried Lincoln's body from Washington to Illinois traveled for 13 days. It stopped in cities along the way: Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago. In each city, thousands of people lined the streets. They stood in silence as the train passed. They wept. They prayed. They said goodbye. In some cities, Lincoln's body was displayed in state. People filed past the open casket. They looked at his face. They saw the wound, the damage, the finality of death. Many had never seen Lincoln in person. Now they saw him dead. It was a strange kind of intimacy, a shared grief. The train finally arrived in Springfield, Illinois, on May 3, 1865. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery. The funeral was simple, understated, the way Lincoln would have wanted it. But even in death, he could not rest. His body was moved several times over the years. There were fears that grave robbers would steal it, that it would be held for ransom. Eventually, it was encased in concrete, 10 feet underground, sealed forever. Mary Lincoln never recovered from her husband's death. She spiraled into depression, into madness. She spent money recklessly. She claimed to hear Lincoln's voice. She saw visions. Her son Robert eventually had her committed to an asylum. She was released after a few months, but she was never the same. She died in 1882, alone and broken. Robert Lincoln, the president's oldest son, went on to have a successful career. He became Secretary of War, president of the Pullman Company, a wealthy man, but he was haunted by death. He was present at his father's assassination. He was present when President Garfield was shot in 1881, and he was present when President McKinley was shot in 1901. He refused to attend any more presidential events. He said he was cursed. Edwin Booth, John Wilkes Booth's brother, was devastated by the assassination. He retired from acting for a year. He considered leaving the country, but eventually he returned to the stage. He continued to be celebrated as one of the greatest actors of his generation, but he carried the weight of his brother's crime for the rest of his life. He never spoke of John publicly. He never defended him. He simply tried to move forward. The Booth family name was stained, forever associated with assassination, with treason, with shame. Edwin tried to rebuild it, to redeem it through his art, but the shadow never fully lifted. In the years after the assassination, conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed that Edwin Stanton had orchestrated the plot, that he wanted Johnson to become president. Others claimed that the Catholic Church was involved, that the Jesuits had ordered Lincoln's death. There was no evidence for any of these claims, but they persisted. They still persist today. The truth is simpler and sadder. A small group of men, driven by ideology and rage, decided to kill the president. They succeeded, and the country paid the price. Not that Lincoln's death redeemed the war, not that Booth was simply evil, but that history is made of moments, small moments, a guard walking away, a trigger pulled, a breath taken. And then, silence. What remains is the question that Lincoln himself might have asked. What do we do now? How do we move forward? How do we honor the dead? How do we build something better? Lincoln's answer was clear: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. Those words were not just a vision for his time, they were a vision for all time, a reminder that healing is possible, that reconciliation is possible, that we can choose to be better. But choosing to be better requires work. It requires sacrifice. It requires acknowledging the past, understanding it, learning from it, and refusing to repeat it. The story of Lincoln's assassination is not just about what happened on April 14th, 1865. It is about everything that led to it, the choices made, the hatreds nurtured, the compromises avoided, the violence accepted, and it is about everything that came after, the failures, the betrayals, the slow, painful work of trying to become a better country. Lincoln did not live to see that work completed. He did not live to see whether his vision would be realized. He died in a small room in a boarding house, surrounded by strangers, having spent his last conscious moments laughing at a play. There is something unbearably human about that, something that reminds us that history is not made by monuments. It is made by people, flawed people, tired people, people who make mistakes, people who try anyway. And maybe that is the real legacy of Abraham Lincoln. Not that he was perfect, not that he solved every problem, not that his death redeemed anything, but that he tried, that he believed, that he held on to hope even when hope seemed impossible. Booth believed in nothing but his own righteousness, and he died with nothing but regret. Lincoln believed in the possibility of a better country, and he died hoping it would come to pass. 160 years later, we are still trying to answer the question he left behind: will it?